The second leg of the Lenten journey, how's it going for you? Are you taking the time, making the time to look inward, self-introspection, looking on the inside of yourself? Doing some spiritual house cleaning, perhaps, a little early? Reprioritizing things? Making note of where you are, where you've been, where you want to be, how you're going to get there? Well, my Lenten journey got a jump start this year by spending Fat Tuesday serving on my first jury duty ever. I know, it was an honor. Although some of you are saying, oh, you poor thing, you had to go through that. It turned out to be surprisingly interesting for me. It really did. I know some people dread that, but it was interesting. And I really found myself intrigued by sort of the authority and the intimidation that goes along with the court system. And not just the way that you're treated by the personnel of calling you out by numbers and such, but even the setting was a little intimidating as we sat gathered in a small courtroom about to take being interviewed to see if we would be selected as jurors. I think there was 26 or 28 of us, complete strangers, gathered in this room, and the tension was thick, and the silence was deafening. And finally, after about 10 minutes I don't even think people were coughing or unwrapping noisy candy wrappers, someone in the back row said something like, "Anybody know any good jokes?" And there was the nervous laughter, and then more nervous laughter as some really bad jokes came across. But it lightened things up a little bit. I really had thought that I would prepare myself for jury duty by watching 12 Angry Men again. The classic black and white, although the newer edition isn't too bad either. And then I was going to do some binge watching of things like, Law and Order or good old Perry Mason to kind of know what I was in for on my jury duty. Well, we waited about 2 hours in this small courtroom waiting to be interviewed before the accused finally pled guilty, and the case was, we were dismissed. But during that time, it afforded me the opportunity to reflect and wonder mentally about some things, part of which I'd like to share with you this morning. I hope they might be helpful to you. The laws that we follow today in our country have a rich history in the Bible. In fact, the biblical laws are the basis for our entire modern-day civil justice system. We call them the Judeo-Christian laws. Laws that we follow in a variety of ways. In the Bible, there are many laws which regard of how society is supposed to live. And by these laws, are included in them, is prohibitions against some specific wrongs, and then the remedies to right those wrongs, and some of those are pretty severe as well. But many of these same rules are dealing with the wrongs and remedies that are in use today as well. The most obvious correlation between our civil laws and the biblical laws are contained in what we know as the Ten Commandments. The foundation stone, really, of our judicial system is that concept of justice. And that certainly is the case in the Bible as well, but also emphasizes another aspect, that of righteousness, being set right with someone in its court system. And the Old Testament is filled with references to the legal systems of the day. In the prophecy of Amos, it talks about we are to hate evil, love good, and maintain justice in courts. In Deuteronomy, which is one of 5 books that we consider the books of law, Deuteronomy simply means second law. It says, "Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Follow justice and justice alone." Another psalm suggests, "Blessed are they who maintain justice, who continually do what is right." And lastly, from the prophecy of Micah, one of my favorites, "He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And that's just in the Old Testament. That's just a smattering of those references. And certainly on into the New Testament, Jesus oftentimes referred to the importance of justice as it was related to the law as well. Now, we don't always agree with the decisions that courts hand down, for sure. And just when we think that there can't be a more bizarre case coming before a court, one comes forward. You may remember several years ago now about Ernie Chambers. Does that name sound familiar to anyone? Senator Ernie Chambers. He's out of Omaha, Nebraska. He's a state senator. And he is known around his state and sometimes around the country for his rather controversial stands on certain issues. After he had heard about a lawsuit that had been filed in federal court that he considered so frivolous, he finally decided to attack the issue by proving that you can sue anyone, anytime, anywhere. And so Ernie lawyered up and decided to sue God. This is in the books. The suit accused God of making and continuing to make terroristic threats of grave harm to innumerable persons, including the constituents of plaintiff, Senator Chambers, who plaintiff has the duty to represent. In addition, he said, God has caused fearsome floods, egregious earthquakes, horrendous hurricanes, terrifying tornadoes, pestilential plagues, ferocious famines, devastating droughts, genocidal wars, birth defects, and the like, as well as calamitous catastrophes, resulting in the widespread death, destruction, and terrorization of millions upon millions of the earth's inhabitants, including innocent babes, children, the aged and infirm, without mercy or distinction. As you might guess from the charges, Senator Chambers is not a practicing Christian. He sees himself as an agnostic, one who thinks there may be a God out there, but we just can't know. He also has a flair for political grandstanding, which many suggested this particular case was. But it does raise a common theological question that we don't like to talk about publicly, but we oftentimes, when we're by ourselves, we're perhaps asking some of the same kinds of questions that the senator is. Chambers certainly was not alone in his accusations, now or historically. So the question is, how might God defend himself to these charges? What would happen if God actually showed up in the courtroom to be a part of this trial? That scenario has really made its way to the stage and to the screen and even in books from both secular perspectives and sacred perspectives. The old poster that if you were accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And there is a legal precedence for putting God on trial. In fact, it's found right here in our morning's text, Psalm 13. It's a classic case of a human plaintiff looking for justice from a divine defendant, sort of like a spiritualized episode of Law and Order, if you will. Have you ever heard somebody say that, I don't like to pray for myself, or I don't want to ask other people to pray for me because it's just kind of selfish and self-serving? Well, the author of today's lesson, Psalm 13, has no reservations or hesitancy to reach out to others and ask for help. In fact, he earnestly prays to God for deliverance from some personal distress, and he fully expects that God is going to answer his prayers. This psalm, number 13, is a type of psalm that is commonly known as a personal lament. In fact, more specifically by Bible scholars, it's referred to as a spiritual lament of the individual. And that expression of individuality as opposed to kind of the corporate, where we move as a great people or as a faith tradition, that's not necessarily the emphasis in the Bible. But these little personal insights into people's personal grief and fear and concern and anguish appear in these what we call the wisdom literature of the Bible. That includes the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And like the majority of these personal laments, this psalm is simply a cry for help. Help. The psalmist prays to be delivered from some personal distress. we don't know exactly what that distress is. As I mentioned to you in the intro of it, tradition suggests that this was written by David, and it was written in a time in his life where he had been sort of the prodigy of Saul, and now he was becoming more popular and Saul was becoming less. Saul was threatened, and he was out to find and kill David. And he chased him around the Holy Land for quite some time. It's during this period. But without knowing exactly what the distress is of the writer of this particular psalm, I think sometimes there's an advantage to that because it allows us the opportunity to fill it in with our own personal crises. And I'd encourage you as you listen to this message this morning and look over this psalm to insert your specifics into this personal lament, this cry to God for help. That we don't like to pray in public, but we certainly pray it alone, don't we? I do. The psalmist here is acting as both the plaintiff and the prosecutor, and he calls God to sort of come to the witness stand and accuses God of a couple of things. There seems to be some abandonment issues that he's struggling with, this alienation of affection, of not feeling the love of God that God so professes. And then there's sort of an apathy, this failure to intervene on the plaintiff's behalf, who is apparently in conflict with some kind of third party, which may be a human enemy. In David's case, it would have been Saul. But it may be just that global, natural enemy of life, which is death, that is haunting this individual. In this case, there's no accusation that God causes the evil. That's nowhere to be found in this. But it is that God seems to turn a blind eye to that same evil. Okay, you may not have brought it on, but it's here. So now what are you going to do about it for me? And yet God seems to refuse to do anything about it. The psalmist repeats over and over, and he attempts to get God to do something, but all has gone for naught. God simply isn't answering. God's not on trial here. God's absence is on trial. And interesting enough, that was part of Senator Chambers' case that he brought against God as well. Well, the plaintiff's case in this particular psalm is stated rather dramatically, in fact, as dramatically as any courtroom TV drama. And that says something for us today. The psalmist begins with the question, how long? And in the first two verses, he asks that 4 times, each time with a little more intensity. And he's crying out, how long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you look the other way when I'm in need? How long must I be hiding my daily anguish in my heart and not share it? How long shall my enemy have the upper hand? The effect of that repetition is certainly to emphasize the psalmist's perception that, God, you're not doing your job here. Where are you? And apparently the psalmist has presented this petition many times, but with no response. So the question now is expanded from why do you hide your face from me, to how long will you continue to hide your face from me, Lord? That phrase, to hide one's face, was a common poetic expression in the Old Testament. It appears a variety of times. And it really meant to sort of disregard or to ignore an individual, to turn your back on someone, to sort of forget that they're even there, to look right through them. And that's what this psalmist is feeling. The psalmist's troubles reflect a sharp theological problem that remains with us today. And that is either God doesn't exist or he doesn't care. And you know what? I think for a lot of people, it would be easier to believe that God doesn't exist than to believe he doesn't care. Has God forgotten this guy? Has God abandoned him? What about the pain and the suffering that he has had to deal with? And why do his enemies always seem to prevail over him? What's the deal with that, God? Those are some compelling questions to ask. And if we as the jury, the readers in the jury, are kind of anxious, you can almost see straightening up in our chair and sort of leaning in a little bit over the rail maybe even to hear, how is God going to respond to this? What's he going to say? What's his excuse? And just when the tension can't get any higher, the psalmist sort of slams his hand on the prosecutor's podium and sort of in style of the Tom Cruise character in A Few Good Men. And he's really crying out, I want the truth. He says, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. That seems like a pretty bold and overly risky demand to be making of the creator of the universe, God himself. But his desperation for justice and some kind of resolution to what's going on in his life outweighs any kind of court etiquette or manners. I want to know the truth. And if God will not help me, then the plaintiff will be at the mercy of the enemy that's waiting outside that courtroom door, whether it be people or places or things, or as I mentioned before, death itself. You know, it's easy to scoff at Senator Chambers for filing a suit against God, but it's a lot harder to make light of what the psalmist is going through. And maybe as you've come in here today, you are not wondering at all why somebody would ask those kinds of questions. How long, O Lord? Because you're right in the middle of something. Some crisis, some relationship, some expectation that you can't meet. Fill in whatever it might be. And it may mirror what that psalmist is crying out. I encourage folks who are struggling with issues to look at the book of Psalms. More than half of them, out of the 150, about 70 of them, are these kinds of personal laments. This idea of thinking that they're alone and nobody's paying attention, and that God is absent, and they're crying out for some kind of help from God or from somebody, anybody. We think oftentimes of the book of Job, and after Job's long lament to God about the position that he's in and all of his problems, God responds with these words, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" It sounds like the equivalent of Jack Nicholson's character shouting to Tom Cruise's character in that same movie, A Few Good Men, when Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth. You want it, you can't handle it." Most of us, as people of faith, we want to believe in things that are beyond the shadow of a doubt. That the things that we share about our faith, people are going to agree with. They're going to buy into hook, line, and sinker. They're not going to argue with us or throw up complaints about it or arguments against it. We want to be sure about what we believe. The problem is that the Bible itself, not non-believers who are questioning us, but the Bible itself is willing to go into those dark shadows of our faith and ask those same hard questions. God, where are you? In the character of Job aside, in our passage, God doesn't say a whole lot from the witness stand in response to these accusations. Instead, it seems that God wants the evidence to speak for itself. So when people cry out in loneliness and pain, and when their enemies lurk outside, just outside their door, God doesn't respond with this lengthy explanation and theological treatise or doctrine about how he operates, or he doesn't provide this bullet list of ways you can get around any crisis in life. Instead, God simply chooses to come alongside of us, to come alongside humanity with not just any kind of love, but a steadfast love, a love that isn't going anywhere, taking on our suffering and redeeming it, making it into something that is helpful, perhaps filled with growing pains, but something that helps us to become stronger, wiser, smarter, more compassionate, more loving. Several messages ago, we talked about that steadfast love, chesed. It's a Hebrew word. It occurs over 250 times in the Old Testament alone. So that means it's a pretty big deal. And it was sort of one of the characteristics of the God of Israel. And it refers, in legalese, it refers to a generously merciful disposition and behavior of a greater party to a lesser. Seldom does it work the other way around, where the lesser party is offering this this mercy to others. But those who are in authority are offering mercy, a compassionate mercy to those in need. And because it's steadfast, because it is always there and dependable, it suddenly becomes trustworthy. And the psalmist declares that, expressing the deepest meaning of belief in the Old Testament. So to believe in God in the Old Testament was not to believe know a lot of facts and figures about him and attributes. To believe in God was to trust in Yahweh, as they called him, utterly and completely, without all of those facts and figures. And the psalmist, in this short psalm, having remembered the evidence of God's steadfast love, when he slows down enough from his ranting and raving, he quickly drops his case, turning his ranting into a song of praise in the last two verses. Blah, 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 blah. How long, how long, how long? But I will always trust in you, and in your mercy I shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has blessed me so richly. The psalm concludes with this profession of trust in Yahweh's steadfast love, his chesed. And that was enough for the psalmist. No further proof necessary. Doubt is not an enemy of faith. In fact, doubt and questioning can lead us to a deeper faith, a more reliable faith, a more realistic faith, a life that can deal with the blows of everyday life. There's a difference between having a faith about God, that he exists somewhere up there, and having a faith in God. And that latter can only come when we're willing to bring our questions, our complaints, and yes, even our doubts to God himself in context of that relationship. That even though the pieces aren't fitting together, we know God doesn't leave a piece out. French author Madeleine L'Engle said, "I will have nothing to do with a God who cares only occasionally. I need a God who is with us always, everywhere, in the deepest depths as well as in the highest heights. It is when things go wrong, when good things do not happen, when our prayers seem to have been lost, that God is most present. We do not need the sheltering wings when things go smoothly. We are closest to God in the darkness, stumbling along blindly." That's God's proof, his evidence, his stand. But the best evidence in God's defense, however, is not in a thing or a place. It's in a person. We know him as Jesus Christ. That God has not dealt with human evil and sin and suffering in some abstract, theoretical, spiritual way. Instead, God took this extraordinary step of becoming one of us, of becoming human, and taking our pain and our fears and our rage and taking it onto himself. So do you want to know where God is in the midst of your suffering and mine? We need to point to only one thing. And that's why it's placed in such a prominent place in Christian churches. It's to the cross. It's to the cross. God's definitive statement of a steadfast love. A steadfast love for the human race, and perhaps more importantly, for you. And that's why it is the focal point of our worship space. Faith is hard to define. One writer observed it this way and suggested thinking of it in these terms, speaking to God here. Because I remember what, God, you have done in the past, and in spite of all the evidence right now that points to your current absence, I will trust you today. And tomorrow I will rejoice in your salvation. I think that's about as good a definition of faith as we could find. And so, on this leg of your Lenten journey of looking within, may this kind of faith get you through get you through not only this season of Lent, but also through this life. For we go forth and we know that our Lord's journeys with us, with his mercy and his steadfast love. And because of God's mercy, we can leave this place in an entirely different way than we came. Because we can go forth now thinking more clearly, feeling more deeply, speaking more truthfully, loving more extravagantly, serving more creatively, giving more lavishly, living more abundantly, and acting more compassionately. Journey on. Amen. Please rise.